Hello there, this is a book review on Ray Dalio's The Changing World Order. A very interesting book. If you're interested in economics, in investing, in finance, particularly in history, I would say this is an excellent book to read. You will gain considerable insight and understanding from one of the world's greatest investors. Ray Dalio has an exceptional record of success in investing. He was the founder of Bridgewater, which I believe is the largest, if it's not the largest, it was the largest hedge fund in the world. And so in reading this book, you're clearly listening to someone who knows what they're talking about, is clearly able to recognize patterns, and is a very analytical and intelligent thinker. Ray Dalio himself has said in a number of interviews and a number of videos that you can watch online, that's one of the key reasons why he wrote this book, was that in understanding events in the world today, in the past, and what could happen in the future, it's important to understand what's happened over a very long period of time. So there is actually a video on this book. If you do not want to read this book, it may take you a month to read this book. It took me around a month. You can simply just watch a 42-minute video produced by Ray Dalio. I will leave the link in the description. Very much worth watching, and it's an excellent video and summarises what this book is about. But so what led Ray Dalio to write this book was that he gives the story of how in 1972 he was taken back and surprised at what happened in the aftermath of President Nixon announcing to the world on the 15th of August that the US would no longer redeem the US dollar, the paperback, the greenback money, with gold. So that's the US effectively came off the gold standard in 1972. You could no longer take your US dollar and have it traded, to have it convertible to gold. That's what happened in 1972. And Ray Dalio, at that time, he was a trader in New York, and he believed that the following day the stock market would crash. He anticipated a great decline in US stocks as a result of this very significant change regarding what money was. You know, because that's quite a significant change. I was born in 1990, and so I've always lived in an era in which we have purely fiat currency. But you know, our parents, grandparents, they lived through this change. Not many people are aware of it, actually, and the significance of it, that the money we carry now is no longer redeemable to gold. You can't take your money to the bank, and the bank give you the fixed rate for it. You can buy gold, of course. Gold now today roughly is $2,000 an ounce. In Britain it's around 1850. But he expected the market to crash, but that wasn't the case. When he went in the next day, he was taken back because there was a huge bulge. The stock market went up, and he didn't understand this. So he then studied what's happened in 1933 under Roosevelt, because the same thing happened then. The government devalued the currency in 1933 as well, and that led to an increase in the stock market and markets going up. Because what effectively you do when you devalue a currency, you weaken the purchasing power of the currency. This happened in 2008, and it recently happened during the COVID pandemic as well, when governments gave out a lot of money. In the UK, we've called that furlough money. And when the government does this, when it effectively prints money, it creates money, issues debt, you increase the money supply. So you can think of this in terms of a lake. And if you imagine you've got lots of boats and ships on the lake, when you increase the money supply, a bit like it's raining, you can hear the rain. Imagine that you increase the money supply and it starts to rain, the amount of water is increasing. So all of the boats and ships, the value of them also rises. So houses, gold, stocks also rise nominally. The price of those assets increase. And that's what happens when governments run deficits and issue debt. They increase the money supply, and this leads to all asset values rising. It's not as simple as that, because there can be supply and demand factors as well. So, for example, in the UK, housing prices have gone up dramatically since 2008, but that isn't purely because interest rates were cut effectively to zero in 2008 and were held that low until very recently, when inflation began to take off as a result largely of the increase in the money supply that the pandemic, from the government's point of view, necessitated. Others have attributed a larger factor, or have said that the Russian war, what's going on in the world regarding oil prices and gas prices and supply and demand, supply chains, has also exacerbated this problem. And economists argue on the extent to which those variables and factors have played a role in the inflation. But monetarists, economists who, like Milton Friedman, argue that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And what they're saying there is that if you increase the amount of money in the economy through governments running deficits, or also private banks issuing credit, because of course when an individual goes to a bank and takes out a loan, a 30-year mortgage, for example, that is also increasing the amount of money, the amount of credit in the economy. And going back to the reservoir, this increases the amount or the number of pounds or dollars there are. And so all the values of assets tend to increase, though not always. With stocks, for example, if you go back to the idea of the ship, if a company itself is running a deficit and has long run a deficit, the water might be rising, but that ship might have a hole in it. And if the ship has a hole in it, even though the tides are rising, the ship's going to sink. So you have to look at the bigger picture, what's happening in the world and what has happened in the world. Ray Dalio talks about 1972, 1933, but the bigger picture as well is that with investing in stocks, the specifics of the company and its own surplus deficit financial situation obviously is also a big factor in determining its future trajectory. But so Ray Dalio goes into that, and what he's saying is that these events, which took him by surprise, led him to try to gain much deeper understanding of what's happened over the last 500 years regarding financial crises and how these fit into a larger picture of big cycles. He refers to something called the big cycle, and the big cycle is the life cycle of a nation or empire, starting with its rise, the top, or its period of dominancy. Since 1944, the US has clearly been the global superpower. The US dollar has been the global reserve currency. It's the currency that a lot of global trade is done in. People save in US dollars, and the US has enjoyed what's known as exorbitant privilege as the global superpower, and this has been the way since 1944. There was something called the Bretton Woods Agreement, which took place at the end of the Second World War, in which Britain ceded that role to the United States. So prior to 1944, the UK was the global superpower. The pound sterling was the reserve currency, and the UK was the dominant power in the world. Prior to the UK, it was the Dutch Empire. There were a number of wars between the Dutch and the British, which I wasn't really aware of before reading this book, because when I was in school it seemed that it was mainly the British and the French who were always at war. But the Dutch Anglo Wars, there were a number of them over, I think, a 150-year period. But it was the fifth one that was decisive in changing the world order. So the Dutch lost the war. They had to devalue their currency, the guilder, which was the global currency in its day, and they ceded that role to the pound sterling, where the pound sterling was the global reserve currency until the Americans in 1944 took that over. So let me show you this graph, because if I just show you this, it will help you to see what I'm talking about and what Ray Dalio is talking about in the book. So take a look at this graph. You'll be able to see that he has plotted these cycles, so you can see them, and you can see the different countries there that he has analysed. The four main ones being the Dutch, the British, the Chinese, and the Americans. And the rise of these empires. So he talks about determinants, and he talks about education being key. He also divides education into two aspects: knowledge and skills, and character. So he does talk about culture and how culture plays a role. For example, how religious institutions promote education and values that encourage civility. He has spoken in a number of interviews about how China, how Confucianism plays a role in how they view their own government. So the way the Chinese think about government is that their leaders are more or less, they have a kind of parental view of their leaders. So they see the leaders as being like a mother or father, kind of strict parents, and China as being sort of one big family. And that is quite unique to how China, for example, thinks about itself and its own political system and form of government. In the UK, we have a very different view of government. And he talks about how in 1689 we had a civil war in England. Essentially what that was a battle between the monarchy and the people that wanted to defend the monarchy, King Charles I, and the parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell. There was a very significant religious aspect to this conflict. It wasn't purely, it certainly wasn't purely about politics. There was a religious dimension to it. Oliver Cromwell and his faction group were Puritans, and so they took a religious view to what the king was doing, and this was a large part of what fueled the division and the anger and the conflict that took place. But one of the consequences of that civil war was the 1689 Bill of Rights, which helped to establish what we still have today, the UK Constitution, and the way we think about government it comes from this unique period, this conflict, which reshaped our internal order in the UK. The English have a particularly unique way of seeing government in the world as well, because we also had Magna Carta in the 1200s as well, and you can see the seeds of the rule of law, the belief that no man is above the law, and not even the king is above law, and he can't just do what he wants, impose taxes, imprison people, possibly kill them if they don't pay taxes. And so we see the emergence of this line of thinking as early as the 1200s in England. But what happened in England in the 17th century, there was a group or a strand of Enlightenment thinkers who we possibly would call the liberals of their day. People like John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, Francis Bacon. What they argued was that, Thomas Hobbes argues for the social contract, and the idea of the social contract is that that humans have natural rights which are given by God, not by government, and among them are life, liberty and property. This is what John Locke puts forward in his book. He actually had to move to Holland because he faced persecution, because the consequence of that belief that humans are given certain inalienable rights. The Americans came up with the term inalienable rights in their own constitution. They based their constitution on what John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, their way of thinking, their ideas. And so what they've said is that if the government or the king, in the case of the late 17th century, encroaches upon the natural rights of life, liberty and property, then the people have the right to replace that government with one that will uphold those natural rights. And so that was a key philosophical trend that took place in the 17th century, and as it so happened succeeded, because that is what actually took place in the 17th century, was that the king and the monarchy lost a lot of its power to Parliament, and you can view English history as being one of gradual democratisation of power. And so this is what happened in the 17th century, and Ray Dalio talks about how this led to stability and civility, or increased stability and civility, which led to the following determinants occurring. So competitiveness. So first of all, education is clearly important in the rise of an empire. And then with increasing knowledge, skills and understanding, you have increasing competitiveness with the world. This leads to innovation and technology. So in talking about the rise of Holland, he talks about how they became master shipbuilders, really the leading country for building ships. And I think it's something like 25% of all inventions took place during the Dutch Golden Era, this unique time in Dutch history when they were incredibly creative and inventive, new ideas, new technologies, and this led to their emergence as the global superpower in the 1700s. Increase in economic output, share of world trade, greater military strength. So as a country produces more goods and services and builds global trading networks. The US have an extensive trading network around the world. It's one of the reasons why the US Navy is is almost everywhere on the globe today, has bases in various parts of the world. But that was the case in the 1700s with the Dutch. They had various trading routes and ports and bases for their navy. And one of the key reasons behind the success of the Dutch and the British and of the Americans is the symbiotic relationship between the multinational corporation, in this case the Dutch East India Company, in the case of the UK, the British East India Company, and the government and the navy, which helps to protect those trading routes. So naturally, as the empire expands, the country is going to expand militarily in order to protect those trading routes. This leads to the country becoming a financial centre. So Amsterdam was the leading financial centre of the world prior to London, and was the first place to have a stock market. So people could buy shares in the Dutch East India Company, and this was the first instance of a key aspect of capitalism, which Ray Dalio also considers a key part of explaining why countries rise, in that meritocratic countries that reward talent and hard work are the ones that become more productive. But London then takes over as the financial centre, with more companies on there that people can invest in. They give the company pounds with the hope of getting some return, 5%, 6%, 7% on an annual basis. And this leads to the country gaining the status as reserve currency, having the world's reserve currency, which is the case with the US dollar in the world today. So he goes into all of these aspects of how a country rises. He talks about the fall and the decline as being due to indebtedness, that the country becomes lazy to a certain degree, less competitive, and less inclined to work because because the country becomes so much richer, people get used to a certain living standard, and they become sort of less hungry for success. And people that bet on the continuation of the country continuing to rise, this doesn't happen. The country begins to plateau, and other countries where it's cheaper possibly to make those same goods and services. So what happened in the crossover between the British and the Dutch was that the British learnt how to build ships from the Dutch, but could do so cheaper because their workforce was willing to work for less pay. The Dutch had become quite exuberant in their expectations, and because it was cheaper to build ships in London, London gained, or in England rather, or UK became more competitive, gained competitive advantages. And of course this is happening in China, has happened in China over the last 30 years, where because it's so much cheaper to produce goods and services, to manufacture things, many things, perhaps most things in the world today come from China, because it's so much cheaper. For example, in the UK, we have very high, we have employment legislation which protects employees. We have a lot of health and safety legislation, and we're not as competitive as other countries possibly with regards to certain types of manufacturing. And so in the book, what Ray Dalio argues is that China is on the ascendancy, certainly economically, because it's running, large, or seems to be running a large trading surplus, whereas the US isn't and hasn't for many years. One thing I'll just leave you with, because in the book he gives an analysis of where countries are regarding the big cycle. And I just want to read you what he says about the UK, because it might interest you enough to actually consider reading the book, because I found it genuinely fascinating. I don't fully share some of his conclusions, but I'll just read you what he says about the UK, so you can possibly just see there what his view on the UK is. He goes into all of the major countries. He analyses China, Russia, Germany, France, Japan, the Eurozone. So let me just read you what he says about the UK. So this is what he says. And by the way, I'll just show you this so you can see, he puts it on a chart with some, numbers there. But I'll just read you what he says. So he says that this is our computer-generated reading for the United Kingdom as of August 2021. Based on our latest readings, the United Kingdom appears to be a modest power in the bottom half of major countries on a flat trajectory. As shown in the table, the key strength of the UK is its strong rule of law, low corruption. I would certainly agree with that. Its weaknesses are its unfavourable economic financial position and its relative lack of natural resources. I would also agree with that. I think running deficits is something we should reverse as quickly as possible. Not easy in a democracy, because cutting public services over the last 15 years has become a very much heated political topic in the UK. The austerity measures over the last 14 years, whether you agree or disagree with them, have caused quite a large political division and animosity to a large extent, but that's what he says in the book. He says, to understand a country, we start by looking at the big cycles as well as measures of power that both reflect and drive the rise and fall of a country. For the UK, the big cycles look mostly unfavourable. The UK is in an unfavourable position in its economic and financial cycles, with a high debt burden and relatively low expected real growth over the next 10 years, roughly 0.9% per year. The UK has modestly more foreign debts than foreign assets. Non-financial debt levels are higher, though government debt levels are typical for major countries today. The bulk of these debts are in its own currency, which mitigates its debt risks. And then he says, on the 8 key measures of power, the UK looks somewhat weak in aggregate. It has no particularly prominent strengths or weaknesses that I will call out. So his assessment of the UK is pretty bleak. And yeah, I must say I would say I broadly agree with that general description on the current trajectory. I think economically, I think there is a lot to be done regarding trying to run surpluses. That should be the goal, in my view, because we keep racking up debt. You can't keep doing that indefinitely and expect people to hold bonds, UK government bonds, particularly if that debt is growing relative to productivity. So for me, it is a worry, and I do hope we can do something about it. And he also talks about US. He's quite pessimistic regarding the US. I'll just show you the table. So he's also analysed the US with the same metrics. And you can see there roughly what he thinks about the US. So he also says the big cycles look unfavourable for the US, and has said that internal disorder is a high risk. He wrote this prior to some of the recent problems the US has had politically. So in some sense, he seems to have been somewhat proven right regarding these rather turbulent divisions that are very notable in the US in particular. But I think my own opinion on the US, I think it's too easy to be pessimistic about the US. I think that what he has underestimated, Ray Dalio, is the creativity of the United States. And because it's not easy to measure that, how creative a country is as a consequence of being free. You know, if you have a free society, people will spontaneously come up with new ideas. And if they're allowed to say and do pretty much what they want, I think it's a good system. And I think that the capitalist profit motive, I think it's been too easy to criticise that, and I think that there's no telling. It's difficult to predict the US because it's impossible to tell where the next innovations will occur. People are talking about AI and how transformative that will be. It remains unseen regarding the effects and the impacts of that. I tend to think they will be large. I don't fully believe in the there's a lot of doom and gloom, and I think it's excessive. There will undoubtedly be huge impacts of AI, but most of that, I think there'll be a lot of problems, possibly, but there'll be many good things that come out of that as well. So I think it's too easy to be pessimistic about the US. I also think that one thing that he hasn't mentioned is that the US and the UK still have some of the best universities in the world, and people from all around the globe, very talented, hard-working people, still wish to go to the US and the UK. And the effects of that, the brain drain, if you will, which particularly the US enjoys in a sense. It's not so good possibly for those other countries, but the US clearly still enjoys a leading position with regards to its educational institutions, and the UK is strong in this area too. So I'm a little bit more optimistic than Mr. Dalio regarding the US and the UK, but I think he puts his finger on a clear problem in the economic mode of thinking regarding deficits, and I think that we do need to have a serious discussion regarding this, because we cannot continue to live far in excess of our means, and we've really got to, in my view, try to achieve a balanced budget, and I think that the benefits of that would be very large indeed. What Ray Dalio also recommends in this book is civility. He sees the solution or the positive ways forward as being, one, to address the deficit position, and number two is to try to encourage civility. And he is an advocate for the middle ground in the US, for the middle ground in US politics between the right and the left coming together to compromise and come up with ways forward that benefit most people. And in the UK, we don't really have this problem anywhere near the extent to which it seems the Americans do. But reason, rationality, compromise, all very important. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video. Do check out this book if you are interested in economics, because it will really make you think, and you might agree, disagree with some of the views, but food for thought, and will probably lead you on to looking at other events and other phenomena, and you'll learn a lot from the secondary consequences of reading this book and wanting to find out more about various things. So thank you for watching. I will post another video next week, so every Saturday I will upload a video, and hopefully you find it useful and interesting. Thank you.